Hello everyone, viewers. We all think we know the story of the Knights Templar. We see the white mantle, the blood-red cross. We hear the tales of warrior monks, lions on the battlefield, the shock troops of the Crusades. We hear about their fabulous wealth, a treasure so vast it's become the stuff of legend. But what if the story we know is a lie? What if their riches weren't just gold and silver, but a secret so powerful, so dangerous, that the most powerful king in Europe decided it was better to burn an entire holy order to the ground than to let it see the light of day? This isn't a story about wealth, it is a story about what happens when power becomes a threat to power itself. It is the story of how the medieval world's richest warriors became hunted heretics, and how a conspiracy born in the shadowy halls of a royal palace brought them to the real story, the one written in blood and fire, is far more terrifying and far more real. In the year of our Lord 1306, the world of Jacques de Molay was one of order, faith, and immense power. As the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, he stood at the helm of an institution that was more than just a military order. It was the world's first multinational corporation. For nearly 200 years, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon had been the sword arm of Christendom. Born in the dust of the First Crusade, their mission was simple and noble: to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. From a humble band of 9 knights, they had grown into a force that made kings tremble. Their fortresses, called preceptories, dotted the landscape from London to the Holy Land. Their ships commanded the Mediterranean, and their wealth was legendary. They had invented banking as we know it. A nobleman in Paris could deposit his gold with the Templars and receive a coded letter of credit, which he could then cash in Jerusalem. They were the trusted financiers of popes and kings. They answered to no king, no bishop, only to the Pope himself. They were, in a word, untouchable. Jacques de Molay, a veteran of the endless wars in the East, a man hardened by decades of battle and devotion, felt the weight of this legacy on his shoulders. He was an old man now, his face a roadmap of desert campaigns and political struggles. He had seen the last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land fall, a bitter failure that haunted him and all of Christendom. Yet the order remained strong. In Europe, their power was at its zenith. They were landlords, farmers, financiers, diplomats, and warriors, but power, de Molay knew, breeds envy, and in the heart of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, a storm was That kingdom was France, and its king was Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair. The name was a reference to his handsome features, but it belied a will of cold, forged iron. Philip was a new kind of monarch. He believed in the absolute power of the crown, a centralized state where the king's will was law. He saw France not as a loose collection of feudal territories, but as a single powerful. His wars against the English and the Flemish had bled the royal treasury dry. He had already debased the currency, persecuted the Jews and the Lombard bankers, seizing their assets to fill his coffers. But it was never enough, and every day, as he looked out from his palace on the Fele de la Cité in Paris, he saw a constant, galling reminder of a power within his own kingdom that was not his. Just across the way stood the Templar enclosure, a massive, fortified complex that served as the Order's headquarters in France. It was a city within a city, a fortress of finance and military might. The Templars stored the royal treasury of France there, yet their own wealth dwarfed it. They operated outside his laws, paid no taxes to him, and their loyalty was to a distant pope, to a king like Philip. They were not just wealthy subjects, they were a sovereign entity, a state within his state, a cancer. Philip was a man who saw conspiracies everywhere, and he had a chief minister who was an artist at turning those paranoid visions into reality. Guillaume de Nogaret, a man whose own family had been branded as heretics and persecuted by the church. Nogaret was not a nobleman or a knight. He was a lawyer, a bureaucrat, a man who wielded laws and whispers like a sword. He was Philip's shadow, his enforcer, a man utterly devoted to the supremacy of the king. It was Nogaret who had masterminded the kidnapping of the previous pope, Boniface VIII, when he dared to challenge Philip's authority. The Pope died shortly after the ordeal, a shocking event that sent tremors through Christendom. For Nogaret and Philip, no one was untouchable, not even the Vicar of Christ. Now they had a new Pope, Clement V, a Frenchman, a man who, conveniently, had decided to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon, just across the river from French territory. Clement was a weaker man, more politician than the king had his pope in his pocket. The board was set. The pieces were in place. All they needed was a pretext, a weapon sharp enough to cut through 2 centuries of piety and power. They found it in the whispers of a disgruntled man. His name was Escure de Floyran, a man who claimed to have once been a Templar. He was a prisoner, sharing a cell with another inmate, and in the dead of night, a tale of secret rituals, of spitting on the cross, of denying Christ, of worshipping a strange, bearded head called Baphomet. He spoke of institutionalized sodomy and obscene kisses. It was a story of a holy order that was, in secret, a den of blasphemy and devil worship. Whether de Floyran believed his own stories, or was simply trying to bargain his way out of prison, they reached the court of King Philip. For Nogaret, it was perfect. Heresy, the ultimate crime, the one charge against which there was no defense. You couldn't fight it on a battlefield, you couldn't buy your way out of it. It was a spiritual stain that, once applied, could not be washed away. It was the weapon they needed. The plan was audacious, breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. They would destroy its name, its reputation, its very soul. Secret orders were drafted, sealed, and sent by royal messenger to every corner of the kingdom, to every seneschal, every bailiff, every royal agent. The instructions were precise. They were not to be opened until a specific day at a specific hour. In the autumn of 1307, the pretext was a meeting with the Pope to discuss a new crusade, a noble cause to reclaim the Holy Land, de Molay, ever the faithful servant of the Church. Obeyed. He arrived in Paris with 60 of his most senior knights and a portion of the order's treasure. He met with King Philip, who greeted him with smiles and honors. They discussed the crusade. They spoke of unifying the Templars with their rival order, the Knights Hospitaller, a proposal de Molay politely but firmly opposed. The Grand Master felt secure. He was in the heart of Christendom, under the supposed protection of a friendly king and a compliant pope. He heard rumors, whispers of strange accusations against his order, but he dismissed them. He even spoke to the Pope about them, demanding an inquiry to clear the Templars' holy name. The Pope reassured him. An inquiry would be held, everything would be fine. De Molay had no idea that the sealed orders were already waiting in the hands of Philip's men across the entire nation. He had no idea that the smiles of the king were the smiles of a predator. He was walking into a perfectly laid trap. The air in Paris that Thursday night was cold and still. In the Templar enclosure, the knights went about their evening rituals. They prayed, they ate in silence, they prepared for the dawn. They were warriors of God, secure in their faith and their purpose. They had no idea that hundreds of royal soldiers were silently taking up positions around their walls. They had no idea that this was their last night on. As the first hint of grey light touched the eastern sky, the storm broke. All across France, at the exact same hour, the king's men struck. Doors were smashed open. Knights, many of them old men, were dragged from their beds, bewildered and confused. In Paris, Guillaume de Nogaret himself led the raid on the enclosure. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was arrested. The trap had been sprung. The speed and coordination of the operation were terrifying. In a single morning, the spine of the Knights Templar in France was broken. Thousands of knights, sergeants, and staff were in chains. Their properties were seized, their lands confiscated, their documents impounded, all in the name of the king and the Holy Inquisition. The shockwave rippled across Europe. How could the champions of the faith, accused of heresy? It was unthinkable, but Philip and Nogaret had prepared for this. A flood of propaganda was unleashed. Royal agents preached in public squares, reading out a list of charges so vile, so depraved, that they left the common folk speechless. spitting on the cross, denying Christ, worshipping an idol named Baphomet, obscene homosexuality, financial corruption. The list went on and on. It was a character assassination on a national scale. The people who had once admired the Templars were now taught to fear and despise them. And then came the confessions. The knights were handed over to the inquisitors, and in the dark, damp dungeons of Philip's castles, the real work began, torture. The medieval world there was the rack, which stretched a man's body until his joints popped from their sockets. There was strappado, where the hands were tied behind the back, and the victim was hoisted into the air and then dropped, dislocating their shoulders. There were boots fitted with screws that could be tightened to crush the bones of the feet and legs. Fire was applied to greased soles day after day, week after week, in the cold and the dark. The night. Imagine a knight. A man who had faced death in battle 100 times without flinching. A man whose entire life was built on a foundation of courage, honor, and faith. Now he is chained in a lightless cell. He is starved, sleep deprived. His body is a symphony of agony. The inquisitor's voice drones on, a calm, reasonable poison in the dark. Just confess. Your brothers have already told us everything. Just admit your sin, repent, and the Holy Mother Church will welcome you back. Deny it, and the pain will only get worse, and in the end, you will burn. What did they confess to? They confessed to everything. Under unbearable agony, men will say anything. Jacques de Molay himself, the proud Grand Master, confessed. They say he was shown the rack and the old warrior. He confessed to denying Christ and spitting on the cross. But he insisted these were just bizarre parts of a secret initiation ceremony, a test of faith, not a genuine act of heresy. He denied the more lurid charges of idolatry and sodomy, but it didn't matter. The inquisitors had what they needed, a confession from the Grand Master himself. The news was a hammer blow to the order's If their own leader admitted guilt, surely it must all be true. If you are finding this untold story as fascinating as I am and want to uncover more of history's darkest secrets, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us dig deeper into these incredible tales. Pope Clement V was horrified. This was his order, his personal army. Philip had acted without his consent. He issued papal bulls, demanding that the Templars and their property be handed over to him. He suspended the authority of the French inquisitors for a moment. It seemed like the Pope might stand up to the king, that a real trial, a fair trial, might take place. Philip's response was pure political theatre and brutal intimidation. He called a grand assembly in the city of Tours. He presented the Templars' confessions, painting a picture of a depraved cult that threatened the very foundations of France. He whipped the assembly into a patriotic, pious frenzy. Who were these Templars? This arrogant foreign power to defy their king. The message to the Pope was clear. The French people and their king believe the Templars are guilty. If you stand in our way, you will be seen. He began to circulate charges of heresy against the dead Pope Boniface VIII, Philip's old enemy. It was a thinly veiled threat to Clement V. If you don't do as we say, we will put your predecessor on trial, an act that would shatter the authority and legitimacy of the papacy. Clement, trapped in Avignon, surrounded by French power, buckled. He withdrew his bulls. He agreed to a new inquiry, one that would be controlled by Philip's men. He had played his hand and lost. He was no longer a player in this game. He was a pawn. But then something remarkable happened. The spirit of the Templars, seemingly broken, began to stir. The Pope had managed to secure one small victory. He would hear the testimony of the senior Templar leaders himself. In the summer of 1308, 72 knights, including Jacques de Molay, were brought before him at the castle of Chinon, away from Philip's torturers. In the presence of the Vicar of Christ, they found their courage. One by one, they recanted their confessions. They told the Pope they had lied under duress, that the accusations were a monstrous fiction. Jacques de Molay, on his knees, his voice filled with emotion, retracted his confession entirely. He professed his and his order's complete innocence. He begged for the Pope's mercy and justice. This was Clement's chance. He had direct testimony from the leadership. He knew the confessions were coerced. He could have exonerated them, stood up to Philip, and saved the order. He forgave them for the sin of heresy that they had confessed to under torture, even though they now claimed innocence. It was a bizarre legalistic compromise. He was trying to save the men without saving the order. He was trying to placate the king while maintaining a shred of papal authority. But in a fight between a wolf and a sheep, compromise only means the wolf eats a little slower. Philip was enraged. His case, built on these confessions, was crumbling. He needed to make an example. He needed to show the other knights what happened to those who defied the king. A new papal commission was set up in Paris to hear the defences of the order. Hundreds of Templars, emboldened by their leader's courage, volunteered to speak. They organized a defense led by two brilliant Templar lawyers, Pierre de Bologna and Renaud. They systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. They pointed out the contradictions in the confessions they described, in horrifying detail, the tortures they had endured. They explained that anyone who dared to defend the order was being starved and kept in the most vile dungeons. For a moment, it looked like they might actually win. The tide seemed to be turning. Public opinion was shifting. The commission was being... Philip and Nogaret knew they were losing control. They had to act, and act decisively. They found their tool in Philippe de Marigny, the new Archbishop of Sens, a man who was the brother of one of Philip's key ministers, a puppet. In May 1310, Marigny convened his own provincial council, citing a papal bull that allowed for swift punishment of relapsed heretics. He declared that the Templars who had recanted their original confessions were guilty. Their crime wasn't the original heresy, it was the sin of recanting. It was a legal technicality, a cruel perversion of justice designed for one purpose, terror. The very next day, 54 Knights Templar were taken from their cells. They were loaded onto carts and taken to a field outside Paris. They were tied to stakes. The firewood was piled high around them. They were offered a final chance. Reaffirm your original confessions, and you will be spared the fire and allowed to live out your days in a prison cell. Not one of them accepted. As the flames licked at their feet, they maintained their innocence to the last. They called out the name of Jesus, their leader, the spokesman for the defense, begged the crowd to turn his body so he could face the Cathedral of Notre Dame as he died. The message to the remaining Templars was brutal and clear: defend the order and you will burn. The organized defense collapsed overnight. The two lawyer knights leading it vanished, presumed to have been silenced in some dark dungeon. The remaining knights, terrified and leaderless. The trial was over. All that was left was the sentence. For 2 more years, Pope Clement V dithered. He convened a grand church council at Vienne to decide the order's fate. Even there, most of the bishops wanted to allow the Templars to present a defense. Philip would have none of it. He marched his army to the gates of Vienne, a clear act of intimidation. On the 22nd of March 1312, in a secret session, he didn't condemn them. He didn't declare them guilty of heresy. He used a legal loophole, stating that for the good of the Church and to avoid scandal, the order was being dissolved by papal decree. It was the ultimate act of a coward, a man trying to wash his hands of a crime he had enabled. The Templars, as a legal and spiritual entity, ceased to exist. Their vast wealth and lands were ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, King Philip and other monarchs across Europe took the lion's share, paying themselves handsomely for the costs of the investigation. The great conspiracy had succeeded. The king had his money. The order was destroyed. For Jacques de Molay and 3 other senior leaders, the end. Their fate was left to a panel of cardinals. In March 1314, a scaffold was erected in the public square in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. The 4 old men, frail and broken by their long imprisonment, were led out into the daylight. The cardinals read out their final sentence. Because they had confessed, they would be shown mercy. The sentence was life in prison. But something inside Jacques de Molay... As the sentence was read, he and his companion, Geoffroy de Charny, suddenly found their voices. They shouted out to the stunned crowd. They were not guilty, their confessions were lies, forced from them through the pain of torture. The order was pure and holy. Their only crime, they cried, was to have betrayed their temple and their brothers in a moment of weakness to save their own lives. They were innocent. This public defiance was an insult to his absolute authority. It undermined the entire justification for his actions. He made a decision on the spot. There would be no more delays, no more trials. He declared them relapsed heretics, and the sentence for that was immediate death by fire. That same evening, as the sun set over Paris, a new pyre was built on a small island in the river Seine, the Fain des Chaviots. They were tied to the stake. De Molay, it is said, made 2 final requests. He asked to be tied facing the cathedral of Notre Dame, so he could look upon the house of God's mother as he died, and he asked that his hands be left untied, so he could join them in a final prayer. He refused to show any fear. He stood at the stake, a defiant old man, stripped of his power, his order, and as the executioner lit the pyre as the flames began to climb, legend says that Jacques de Molay's voice rose above the crackling of the wood, a voice that was no longer that of a broken prisoner, but of a prophet. He called out, not for mercy, but for judgment. He summoned his accusers to meet him before God's tribunal to answer for their crimes. "Pope Clement!" he bellowed, his voice, "and you, King Philip, and you, Guillaume de Nogaret, within a year and a day I summon you to the judgment seat of God, a curse upon your bloodline for 13 generations. The crowd watched in terrified silence as the flames consumed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He died proclaiming his innocence, a martyr for an order that no longer existed. But the story doesn't quite end there. The curse. Was it just the final, desperate cry of a dying man or something more? 1 month later, Pope Clement V, who had been suffering from a vile illness, died in agony. His body was laid out in a church which was struck by lightning that same night. The resulting fire was so intense that when they found the Pope's remains, they were little more than a char. Later that year, King Philip the Fair, a strong and healthy man in his mid-40s, was out hunting. He suffered a fall from his horse, a minor accident. But a strange malady took hold of him, he wasted away, and within weeks he was dead. The cause of his death remains a mystery to this day, and Guillaume de Nogaret, the architect of the whole affair. He too died suddenly within the perhaps, but for the people of the 14th century the message was clear. God had rendered his verdict. The curse didn't stop there. Philip's 3 sons all became king, but each died young, leaving no male heir. His dynasty, the Capetian line that had ruled France for over 300 years, was extinguished, plunging France into the chaos and bloodshed of the 100 Years' War. The curse of Jacques Philip had seized their property, but did he get their famous treasure? It seems not. The records show that the French treasury benefited far less than expected. The vast majority of the Templars' liquid assets, their gold, silver, and precious documents, were never found. On the eve of the arrests, it is said that a train of wagons left the Paris temple under cover of darkness, carrying the treasure away. Some say it was loaded onto the Templar fleet at La Rochelle, which also vanished without a trace. Did it go to Scotland to help Robert the Bruce in his fight against England? Did it go to Portugal, where the Templars were found innocent and simply changed their name to the Knights of Christ? Did it cross the Atlantic to Oak Island in Nova Scotia a century before Columbus? The fate of the treasure remained, and what of Baphomet, the strange idol head they were accused of worshipping? No credible evidence of such an idol was ever found. Most historians today believe it was a pure fabrication, a propaganda tool. The name itself might have been a French corruption of Mahomet or Mohammed, a way to paint the knights as secret converts to Islam, the ultimate heresy for a crusading order. But the legend persists, a symbol of the dark, secret knowledge the Templars were said to possess. Did the order truly die in the flames with de Molay, or did it simply go underground for centuries? Organizations like the Freemasons have claimed a direct lineage to the Knights Templar, carrying on their secret traditions in the shadows. Is there any truth to these claims, or is it just a romantic fantasy, The story of the fall of the Knights Templar is a chilling case study in how power, greed, and propaganda can be used to destroy anything, even an institution that seems invincible. It was a conspiracy born of a king's ambition and a lawyer's ruthlessness. It was executed with terrifying efficiency. They used the power of the state and the authority of the church to turn heroes into villains. They showed that if you repeat a lie loud enough and torture enough people to confirm it, it becomes the truth. But in their victory, they created a legend that would far outlive them. By trying to erase the Templars from history, they made them immortal. The mystery of their fate, their lost treasure, and their final curse continues to fascinate us. 700 years later, it's a reminder that history is not always written. Sometimes it's written by the ghosts of the vanquished in whispers of smoke and fire that refuse to be silenced. All right, that is all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and give it a like to support us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.